6 teams are on bye this week, and that's going to make it a little bit tougher to set some winning lineups. But don't worry, we've got you covered. Joining me today, Michael Fabiano, SI's senior fantasy analyst. Fabs, let's just get right to it. Quarterbacks, who can we feel comfortable starting? And I know that, maybe we even need to grab some off the waiver wire. So give us all the good, juicy information.
Let's start off with Geno Smith. It's week 9 and he's still playing really good football. So listen, I was wrong about Geno at the start of the season. I think a lot of folks were, but I'm playing him this week against the Arizona Cardinals. As you mentioned, 6 teams on a bye. The Cardinals have allowed the 6th most points to quarterbacks. They've given up big time numbers, over 18 points to 5 different quarterbacks. And also 4 of those have scored over 23 points. So Geno Smith is a starter, and so is Justin Fields. Last week, he looked great against our beloved Dallas Cowboys, putting up over 25 fantasy points. He's now had 18 plus points in 3 straight games. He's had over 23 in his last 2. He's got the Dolphins this week. They've given up 18 plus fantasy points to 4 quarterbacks since week 2. So Justin Fields is definitely a stardom. I don't know about those orange helmets though.
Yeah, I don't know about the orange helmets either. In fact, on my TV, they looked almost reddish orange. It wasn't good. All right, who are we sitting at the quarterback position this week?
Matthew Stafford's still a sit-in for me, and I get it. He had 17.4 points, and the last time I checked, that's pretty good from a quarterback in 2022, but he rushed for a touchdown. I mean, how often is Matthew Stafford going to rush for a touchdown? And this is not a great matchup against the Bucs. Now, I get it. Their defense has not played great, but they've allowed just 2 quarterbacks to score more than 17.9 fantasy points against them. They're also averaging and allowed an average of 213.9 passing yards per game. So I'm still fading Stafford, and I'm fading Derek Carr. What was that last week? I mean, that was brutal. That was one of the worst performances I've ever seen from any offense. The Raiders were just dreadful last week. Their passing game is a mess. Devontae Adams got nothing last week. I mean, it was just unbelievable, and it wasn't even about the matchup. Now they've got the Jaguars. Their defense has actually allowed an average of 13.8 points per game to quarterbacks who they faced at home. So keep that in mind. Derek Carr, I guess you should park him this week and, heck, maybe throw him on the waiver wire after this Bye-Mageddon week.
Yeah, he certainly has not lived up to expectations. A lot of us thought he would be a sleeper pick. Isn't panning out. All right, running over to the running back position, you got Josh Jacobs and Raheem Mostert in your lineups this week. I love it.
Yeah, the Raiders offense was garbage last week, but I don't blame Josh Jacobs, and I think he's going to have a big game this week. This is more validation than anything else. As you mentioned, there's 6 teams on a bye, but this is a very good matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. This is a defense that's allowed 6 running backs to score 14 plus or more fantasy points against them. They've also given up 20 plus points to 4 different running backs, including Deion Jackson, who is a 3rd string back. You remember that game against the Indianapolis Colts. So I'm going to continue to start Josh Jacobs and Raheem Mostert too. I get it. Last week was a bad week. He had a great matchup. He got game scripted. That was the problem. The Dolphins fell behind. They had to throw the football and abandon the run. Hopefully that won't happen this week against the Bears. They have given up 18 plus fantasy points to 6 different running backs, and Tony Pollard beat them for almost 34 last week. So keep the faith in Raheem Mostert and keep the faith in Josh Jacobs.
Moving on to running backs, you got a couple guys here that have players waiting in the wings for their jobs, so you want to be cautious.
Yeah, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, this isn't even about the matchup so much. It's just about his usage. I mean, look at his numbers, right? He's failed to score more than 9.2 fantasy points in 3 straight games. Isaiah Pacheco was a starter in the week before the bye, and his touch share has declined in 4 straight games. It was 13%, Jen, in Kansas City's last game. So I don't know that you can play Clyde Edwards-Helaire. You probably have to because there's 6 teams off, but beware. And then Damien Harris, at this point, he's going to be borderline droppable in some smaller leagues. He's lost the lead role in the Patriots backfield to Ramondre Stevenson. Look at the numbers, all right? This is a guy who has put up 19 or more touches in 4 straight games compared to Harris, who has seen 17 combined touches in the last 2 weeks. So Damien Harris is a guy that I can't play. The Colts defense, it's not about the matchup. It's about the fact that his usage is so down over the last month. Ramondre Stevenson is now the Patriots running back to own.
All right, jumping over to the wide receiver position, you're starting Christian Kirk this week. You say it's time to go ahead and believe.
Yeah, last week we had him as a sit-em, and he had a stinker. That was against the Broncos, though. The Broncos have one of the better defenses in terms of stopping wide receivers in the whole league. But now he's got the Raiders, all right? No team in the league has allowed more fantasy points to slot receivers than Las Vegas. And of course, Kirk runs about 65% of his routes out of the slot. So he is a very good play this week. And listen, I'm going to go with Juju Smith-Schuster. He's been hot, right? I mean, last 2 games before the bye, 47.4 combined fantasy points. He's got a good matchup against the Titans. They've allowed 9 touchdowns and the 6th most points to wide receivers. So Juju Smith-Schuster is a pretty nice flex option during this week with 6 teams off.
All right, as far as who you're sitting one of the guys on my waiver list, actually 2 of the guys on my waiver list, not because you don't like them long-term, but because this week's matchups aren't ideal.
Right. I mean, Garrett Wilson had a big game last week, but Corey Davis was hurt. Elijah Moore's in the doghouse. It was kind of the perfect storm, and the Jets were playing from behind. Now, they may be playing from behind this week, too, and they probably will be against the Bills. But this defense can be very tough on perimeter receivers. So I wouldn't chase the points with Garrett Wilson. He's a risk-reward flex at best. And the same thing goes with Rondale Moore. He had a really good game last week. That's why, Jen, you said pick him up off the waiver wire. But I don't think I would plug him into lineups. Seattle's defense has allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to perimeter receivers, and they're allowing an average of just 11.3 points to slot receivers. Their defense is really tough against wideouts, so Rondale Moore is a bit of a risk. Again, with so many teams on a bye, you may have to play him. Temper expectations.
Yeah, so many teams on a bye. You're going to go really deep this week. You may be picking up Terrace Marshall Jr. So, take all of this advice and apply it to your specific team, of course. Now, for tight ends, who you're going to start, this time you have a guy on my waiver list and you say it's okay to start him.
Right, and Gerald Everett, number 1, he is coming off a bye. He has averaged about 10 points per game, which is pretty good at tight end position. Keenan Allen's not 100%. Mike Williams is not going to play, and they're playing Atlanta. I mean, they've allowed 7 tight ends to score at least 9.7 fantasy points against them. So Gerald Everett is in a smash spot, and so is Rob Tonyan. He has got a very good matchup. Last week, he had a touchdown called back because of a penalty. He has really done well against Detroit in his career as well. 4 career games, double digits in 3 of those games. And the Lions defense has allowed 9 or more fantasy points to 6 tight ends. And Tunyan's probably one of the few guys that Aaron Rodgers actually trusts in the passing game. So start Robert Tonyan.
And as far as who we're sitting, you say don't chase the points with Tyler Conklin this week.
Tight end's a mess this week because you've got all these players off, you've got injuries, and Tyler Conklin ended up being a stud last week. Nobody saw that coming. 25.9 fantasy points, folks. It's not going to happen again, and it's not going to happen against the Buffalo Bills. This defense has given up fewer than 10 fantasy points to all but 1 tight end, and that was Travis Kelce. So I would not chase the points with Tyler Conklin, and I'm not going to chase the points with Mike Gesicki either. He's very touchdown dependent. In fact, he has scored single-digit fantasy points in every game, Jen, where he hasn't scored a touchdown. And listen to this, the Bears have given up just 2 touchdowns on tight ends all year long, and they've only given up 1 touchdown to a tight end in the last 5 games. So Gesicki is one of those players who is so touchdown dependent. The matchup's not great. I'd keep him on the sidelines.
There you have it, folks. Michael Fabiano's excellent Week 9 advice. For all the start and sit-em advice from Michael Fabiano, you can find it at si.com/fantasy. And it is Bye-Mageddon, 6 teams on bye. So if you need some advice, also check out our waiver wire articles. But don't leave before you hit that subscribe button.